From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. When the US Department of Justice finally released more than 3 million documents from the Epstein files, nobody expected them to land like a ticking time bomb right in the middle of Westminster.
Mandelson betrayed our country, our parliament, and my party. He lied repeatedly to my team. If I knew then what I know now, he would never have been anywhere near government.
All week, a furious Keir Starmer has had to distance himself from the man he'd appointed as his ambassador to Washington. And yesterday, even though he never even met Jeffrey Epstein, he became the first world leader to apologise to his victims.
I am sorry. Sorry for what was done to you. Sorry that so many people with power failed you. Sorry for having believed Mandelson's lies and appointed him.
But will that be enough for even his own backbenchers who are in a mutinous mood?
I think the mood yesterday was the angriest I think I've ever seen Labour MPs in the 16 years that I've been in Parliament. We can't pretend that this is not a crisis situation. I think the PM is up against it.
I was disappointed, I was sickened, and quite frankly, I think the country deserves better.
It could well mark the end of the Prime Minister's time in office, yes, I think so.
Will the Jeffrey Epstein scandal bring down Keir Starmer? How much did he know about Peter Mandelson's continued friendship with a convicted paedophile before appointing him as ambassador? And after 40 years in politics, a number of scandals, and dramatic comebacks, is this now the end of the line for the Prince of Darkness and Labour Party grandee Peter Mandelson? The story today: Mandelson, Epstein, and the fight for survival at number 10.
I'm currently in next to our office in Parliament, where we've been watching events unfold this morning.
That's Steve Swinford, political editor of The Times and our man in Westminster.
With Keir Starmer having just given a press conference in which he has apologised to the victims of Jeffrey Epstein for both appointing Lord Mandelson in the first place and, open quotes, believing his lies.
Steve, what is the mood like in Westminster today?
It depends who you talk to. I mean, the Tories are in great form. They're very happy. Labour is in a really bad place. So we've obviously been talking to a lot of MPs who are very angry about Mandelson. They are very angry that Starmer has admitted that he was aware of Mandelson's links to Epstein and that friendship had continued post-conviction. So Epstein was convicted in 2008 of child sex offences, and Starmer was fully aware that Mandelson maintained that friendship. And I will put it to you, that's not the best look. So Labour MPs are very angry about that. There are various calls. Some people think Starmer should go. Some people are calling for his chief of staff to go. But either way, there has been a massive loss of trust in number 10 and in the Prime Minister.
Some Labour MPs have made it clear that they think the mood is worse than it's ever been.
Prime Minister, I wanted to read out some of the things that Labour MPs have told us in the last 24 hours about you. One told us, "I'm personally not sure I could trust myself to back the Prime Minister in a confidence vote." Another said, "It's like Chris Pincher on steroids, it's over." Another said, "This government is on the run." One former minister said, "It's time for a fresh start, the sooner the better."
There's a real sense of rebellion on the backbenches. There's absolute fury at number 10. Is that how you'd compare it? I mean, have you ever known it this bad? And does it feel like heads will have to roll?
No, I definitely have known it this bad in previous Tory administrations. There were similar scandals that engulfed a couple of those administrations, which felt very like this. I think what we've not got at this stage is anyone going over the top. What we're not seeing is ministerial resignations, which is usually the first big canary in the coal mine. And Starmer is insisting that he's going to continue. But what you are seeing is MPs now publicly criticising the Prime Minister. That spells trouble for the Prime Minister. So look, this isn't a moment where the Prime Minister is about on the brink or going to have to resign today or tomorrow. But there is a huge erosion of trust here that is going to be very, very damaging for him as those big local elections and broader elections approach in May.
What exactly is the charge against Keir Starmer? You mentioned there that he appeared to know that Peter Mandelson had continued a friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. There's a lot of talk about the vetting process. What stage do we think something has gone wrong?
The clear stage that something has gone wrong here and why the trust has been breached is because he appointed Lord Mandelson on trust, basically, just to take listeners through it. He was presented with a due diligence report by the Cabinet Office, which is described to me as essentially a kind of copy and paste job from Google. And it was everything that was publicly known about Mandelson at that point, but particularly around Epstein. And quite a lot was known. There were reports that he had a close friendship with Epstein. There was a particular report that he had stayed in Epstein's apartment in Manhattan while he was serving jail time. So that was very clear. There were lots of pictures of Mandelson and Epstein together at birthdays, at parties, having a good time together. And all of this was in the document. And what the Prime Minister seems to have done is, rather than looking at those reports, looking at the questions that they raise and having concerns about them, he's gone straight to Mandelson. And he asked Mandelson 3 questions, 2 of which are relevant to what we're talking about. 1, what was the nature of your relationship with Epstein? And 2, did you stay in that apartment? And Starmer says that on both counts, Mandelson lied. And he said that at the dispatch box. He's used parliamentary privilege to say that. But ultimately, what that means, and the problem with that, is it's not really a defence, because what you've done is you said, my mistake was to trust Lord Mandelson. Well, obviously, Lord Mandelson was going to distance himself as much from Epstein as possible. He had a vested interest in wanting to become the ambassador of the US. So the bigger question is a fundamental judgment question for Keir Starmer. Why did he take the word of a man who had a vested interest in playing down his links to Epstein over the clear, hard evidence that was in front of him and that was publicly available at the time? So I've spoken to some people that were involved, and they said that they were genuinely shocked. They were baffled as to why further questions weren't asked. And they meant by that further questions of Mandelson. They meant by that further questions of the Department of Justice in the US. And more broadly and fundamentally, if we remove the concerns of the officials for a second, why did he appoint him at all? Ultimately, when you stand back from this story and look at it, the Prime Minister appointed someone that he knew to be a close friend of a convicted paedophile, a close friend post-conviction, as Britain's man in Washington. Now, whatever positive attributes he has, that should have rung extraordinary alarm bells, and for some reason it didn't.
What happens now? You know, we know that there are documents related to that vetting process which will be made public soon. Do we have a sense of a timeline? What's the process?
It's incredibly knotty, and there are a couple of reasons why it's knotty. So first of all, Keir Starmer wanted yesterday, we're speaking the day after Prime Minister's questions, he wanted to have a kind of flourish yesterday where he called Mandelson a liar at the dispatch box and then produced the receipts, produced the documents that he said proved that Mandelson had lied. And that was going to be Mandelson's written responses to the questions I outlined earlier that were direct from the Prime Minister about his relationship with Epstein. And Starmer said that's evidence that he lied. But yesterday morning, Scotland Yard got in touch with Number 10 and said, you cannot release that information. We are concerned that that is going to prejudice our investigation. And if you do that, it's going to create issues for us. So Starmer was left in a position where he admitted that he was aware of the relationship between Mandelson and Epstein before the appointment, but he didn't have the evidence to actually back up his defence that Mandelson had lied. And so that document, that response from Mandelson, is never going to see, or at least until the end of this criminal process, which could be very long, is not going to see the light of day. What we may get is this due diligence report that I was saying earlier, this 2-pager, this Google cut and paste job of the life and times of Lord Mandelson, a kind of very brief précis, but that's all there. There is a much broader element of this, which is that in the Tories' humble address, which is the archaic parliamentary mechanism they use to extract the information about Mandelson from the government, they asked for all communications between Lord Mandelson and ministers, officials, you name it. So when you actually look at the legal power of that, you could argue that everything now has to be disclosed. The other aspect of this, which is complicating it, is the fact that there was a huge rebellion in the Commons yesterday because Labour MPs quite simply don't trust the government on this.
I mean, that really is quite a moment.
The argument they said, and the concern was, we do not trust you to decide which documents shouldn't be published because of national security concerns or because they have an impact on international affairs. We want a body of MPs and peers to do that, a group called the Intelligence and Security Committee, and in a kind of delicious moment from a parliamentary watcher's point of view, the person leading the charge on that was none other than Rana, the former Deputy Prime Minister, who is still furious about the way that Keir Starmer treated her and is seen as a potential leadership rival. So we have Rana showing clear leadership and literally undermining the Prime Minister and his government's position in the Commons, and the government had no choice to back down. And that is because they are weak on this. He has lost control. He's lost control of his backbenchers. He has lost control of the actual documents themselves because the police can block them. And he's lost control over the release of those documents because that is now the ISC's concern, this Intelligence Security Committee's body of MPs and peers. So really, it's very unpredictable what's going to be released, when it's going to be released. And the problem for number 10 is it doesn't know really where this is going to go and it doesn't have the power to control that release. And that's a real issue when you are a prime minister fighting for your political life.
It is a remarkably weak position to be in. Steve, you mentioned that one of the things we might see is effectively the 2-page cut and paste Google document on Peter Mandelson. Some of our older listeners will probably be thinking, to be honest, that should have been enough. This is a man who's had a career that hasn't been free of scandal, and most of the big jobs he gets do tend to end badly. For those who don't remember the entire thing in colour, take us back. Just remind us a bit about Peter Mandelson's career. Where did it begin? How did he begin in the Labour Party?
So Peter Mandelson has had a career in the Labour Party for 40 years. He has been there from the very beginning of the New Labour project alongside Tony Blair. He was the first spin doctor, so he was seen as the Prince of Darkness, the Master of the Dark Arts, you name it. His stuff was all behind the scenes and it was all kind of soft edges, but he probably ended quite a few political careers in his time. He's a very sophisticated operator. And we did an amazing, you can find it on the Times website, but an amazing graphic today, which is all about Peter Mandelson's web of influence in the Labour Party. And it's extraordinary. He knows everybody. He knows, obviously, very close to Tony Blair, was close to Gordon Brown, who gave him a peerage and brought him back. Now, I wasn't in the Commons at that point. I may look old, but I'm not that old. But people tell me that he was a force. And that reputation has continued to this day until the Epstein files kind of blew it apart, that it was one of the reasons that Gordon Brown brought him back in. So he was out over one side. I think he had 2 major resignations.
Yes.
But he came back under Gordon Brown, was given a peerage and in Gordon Brown's dying days. And again, I think one of the things that you see in the Epstein emails when you go through them is just the sheer extent of what Lord Mandelson was doing. So he was there for the end of Gordon Brown's premiership on the dying days. And every minute of that he seems to have been sending to Jeffrey Epstein, including some very unflattering comments about Gordon Brown. So I finally got him, I think, was one of the messages. And you contrasted that with what he said about Gordon Brown in his biography. And he said lovely things in that biography. He said that Gordon Brown was statesmanlike to the last and he just knew that he couldn't be an obstacle, and painted him as this kind of selfless guy that was going because he had to go. Whereas he was actually savaging him, or in these emails, to Jeffrey Epstein. That tells you something about the way I think that Mandelson operated. He was very adept at saying one thing publicly and possibly another thing privately.
There is a duplicity there, and he was hated by some of the old guard, by people like John Prescott, because of it. I think Tony Blair used to say the New Labour project would only be complete when the party learnt to love Peter Mandelson, knowing that so many of them hated him. I remember starting as a very young cub reporter about 20-something years ago, and one of my first run-ins was with Peter Mandelson, who sort of screamed at me when I asked him a difficult question at an event. I got the full Prince of Darkness treatment.
Wow.
Felt incredibly small. And then the next time I saw him, about 2 weeks later, I was at another event, and he saw me and he saw that I was talking to somebody who was very rich. It was actually Nat Rothschild. And he came up to me and was like, darling, air kissed. And I was just like, I have no idea what's just happened. This man was incredibly rude to me. And then he said, won't you introduce me to your friend? And that actually became one of the scandals that hit him later. There is something about Peter Mandelson where all of the times he's been sacked, whether it was over the Hinduja passport and his first resignation, and then a loan from Jeffrey Robinson, another Labour MP, which he hadn't declared. And then the trouble when he wasn't really sacked, but in his EU days where he kept turning up in unfortunate places on yachts with Russian oligarchs when he was supposed to be making decisions about aluminium tariffs and things. He does seem to be drawn to the rich and powerful.
He's very clearly drawn to the rich and powerful, and he's very clearly, when you look at the Epstein papers, drawn to money. And as you said, Manveen, that makes Starmer's decision to appoint him all the more bewildering. I would put it to you that there is a case, even based on his previous scandals, resignations, and the business interests of his subsequent lobbying firm, Global Counsel, which had a lot of controversial interests, that should have probably been enough to steer clear of him. But I also think that what happened was that Donald Trump was seen as the problem to negotiate and to crack, and that was seen as a kind of key part of Starmer's premiership. And it's an unusual president, and that required unusual solutions. And I think that distorted the thinking, quite frankly, in number 10, that they therefore went for someone they thought would get on with Trump on that kind of soft skills kind of way, could network around the MAGA administration. And actually, they didn't need to do that in hindsight.
Steve, this scandal has blown up because of these emails that we're seeing coming out of the Department of Justice that appear to show a very close relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Mandelson. Give us a sense of just how close they are and how far this relationship extends. How long were they in touch?
I think the earliest emails I've seen are from 2003. And it is extensive. I think what's really interesting is it straddles everything. So it straddles the political and the personal. Now, what do I mean by that? So I mean by that Mandelson was giving an inside track on British politics, and there is a suggestion that he sent some very sensitive internal number 10 documents and discussions directly onto Epstein, often within minutes of receiving them. They're just forwarded straight onto Epstein on his BlackBerry. There's an extraordinary sequence of emails in which Epstein basically gives him advice on how he can get more money from a prospective job. So there's an offer from Deutsche Bank on the table, and they've offered him £1 million plus, I think it's 3 to 5 million in share options. That's in a year. So a lot of money on the table.
I think at one point he even recommends he marry a princess.
Yes, it's obviously a good way to do things. There's some appalling jokes around that, which I won't get into on this because I don't think our listeners need to hear some of the really horrendous stuff in the emails. But then on the personal side of it, there is suggestions of a $75,000 payment directly to Mandelson, which Mandelson has said he has no recollection of, so rejects that idea. But he does admit that there was $10,000 that went to his partner, now husband, Ronaldo, for an osteopathy course, which he said is not a conflict of interest because how could that have anything to do with my views on financial regulation, banking, the job of business secretary. But there was also a regular retainer, it looks like, for his partner. At one point it's described as $4,000 a month in the emails, and that is pretty murky territory. This is Mandelson is a business secretary, and he appears, or his partner appears, to be directly benefiting and receiving gifts from Jeffrey Epstein, who is a financier who has a clear interest in what a senior ranking member of the UK government will be doing. But there is also this other dimension to this, which is the kind of, and it is a very clear and intimate friendship. I'll give you some examples. So Epstein refers to Mandelson as PT repeatedly. Epstein gives him marital advice on his partner and suggests at one point that he should leave him because you want a partner in life, not a passenger, as you approach your senility, I think is how Epstein says it. And look, Mandelson, in the message that we've seen, seems to describe Epstein as his best friend. He at one point says that he loves him. There are repeated messages where, this is an example of the kind of exchanges you get, where they always begin from Mandelson, where are you? And Epstein will say, I'm in Paris or New York or St. Bart's, whatever it is, somewhere like that. And then they'll just go into that and say, I miss you. One of the messages that stood out to me was when Mandelson is purported to have told Epstein that he dreamed about him last night.
Oh, wow.
And then probably the most horrible messages that I've seen in the cache are all around Epstein's release from prison. So Epstein is released from prison and Mandelson messages him and describes it as Liberation Day. So that's what he calls it.
Despite his apologies now for the victims and what it must have meant for them.
Yeah. And Epstein then messages back and says, I'm going to celebrate with grace and modesty. And just in case you don't get the illusion of what he's doing there, he includes some brackets, the names of 2 strippers, close brackets. And then Mandelson says, well, how are you going to celebrate? And Epstein says that he's going to enjoy their creamy skin. Also, it's really grim. It's absolutely horrible stuff. And at the end of that exchange, Mandelson says, naughty boy. Now, that is really, really grim and obviously puts Mandelson's claim that he had the victims in mind and all of the stuff that he said in successive interviews since into stark relief.
If I had known, if I was in any way complicit or culpable, of course I would apologise.
But you won't
for it.
For your association with him after his conviction.
But I was not culpable. I was not knowledgeable of what he was doing. And I regret and will regret to my dying day the fact that powerless women who were denied a voice, were not given the protection they were entitled to expect from the American system.
So obviously he did have an idea. There is references to Epstein's sexual predilections in there, particularly for young Russian girls.
Yes.
And they have discussions over that in these emails. So that is what you get. You get this blurring of the professional and the personal in the most extraordinary way across these emails. And there are thousands of them. I think there's nearly 6,000 entries in the database about Mandelson alone.
And Steve, that blurring of the personal and the professional, that kind of takes us on to the reason this turning into a criminal investigation, which is how much was Peter Mandelson helping Jeffrey Epstein while he was in government?
So the Metropolitan Police has launched a formal investigation after reviewing the evidence for an offence called misconduct in public office. And for that, you have to have either kind of deliberately or recklessly shared information. So there's an email that goes directly to a guy who's recorded as John Pond. John Pond was actually an alias used by Gordon Brown, so directly to Gordon Brown. And this was from all about the sale of assets, that essentially there was a post-financial crisis. They were looking to sell off assets, government assets that weren't an integral part of the state to reduce the government debt. And they said in this email from a special advisor, they were saying, yeah, we could look at selling assets and that would help reduce the need for tax rises and could actually now enable us to announce some tax cuts in the run-up to the election. That is clearly market-sensitive information. And he seems to have forwarded that directly to Epstein. And Epstein, perhaps understandably for a financier with interest in stuff like this says, what are the saleable assets? Now, Mandelson doesn't know at that point, but a few months later, indeed, this plan is announced, £16 billion of sales of assets like, bridges, tunnels, that kind of stuff. It's taking it off the government books to reduce the government debt. So that's the level of stuff that we're looking at. There's another exchange when Epstein says that he's heard there's going to be a £500 billion bailout of the euro from sources, and Mandelson comes straight back and says, yep, we're expecting it to be announced tonight. In fact, it's announced the following morning, so he seemed to confirm that. And then they have a conversation. We obviously don't know what was said in that conversation, but they speak to one another that night. So that is what the Metropolitan Police has said it is investigating, whether essentially Mandelson was sharing market-sensitive information and whether there's crucially evidence that he knew what he was doing. And how could you frankly not be? This is an email to the Prime Minister. It's about as sensitive as it gets. And that is kind of just being forwarded on.
And Steve, we should say that Peter Mandelson's position is that he's not acted criminally or for personal gain. But what could happen as a result of this criminal investigation? I mean, how bad might it be for him?
It's about as bad as it gets. This is a criminal investigation. It can carry life imprisonment at the most serious end of it. That's if there's aggravating factors like accepting money and things like that. So we'll see where the investigation goes, but it is very, very serious. And what's fascinating about this investigation, which will dominate for months, is Who are they going to call as witnesses? Well, they're going to interview Mandelson under caution. They're probably going to interview Gordon Brown. They're probably going to interview other senior people as witnesses that were around at the time to say, what do you think of this document being leaked? How significant was it at the time? We know their answers already. A lot of them have already said it. It's the extent of it, really, and the kind of high-profile nature. And that will just drip as this investigation goes on, and at some point they'll contact the Department of Justice. They'll want the unredacted Epstein files, which they'll probably get. It's a weird kind of combination. And how you do an investigation amid that political heat I wouldn't like to be in that position.
Steve, for people listening, it will just raise questions about whether this was somebody who was a minister at the time, whether he was even operating in the national interest, or whether he was much more willing to help his rich, very dubious friends.
I think it just shows the depth and intimacy of that friendship, that he thought this was something that would interest Epstein and therefore sent it to him. And I guess it's all part of a broader network of very, very wealthy individuals. But in the context of the people that Epstein can open up access to and the world that Epstein was swimming in, like Mandelson is not even a minnow. He's a mite compared to what the levels of titanic billionaires that Epstein is mixing with. But what he does have is political capital and influence, and it is the trading of that capital to see these people and presumably one day further his own business interests.
Steve, it does return us to the question of the judgment in placing him in that position. Just give us a sense of what Peter Mandelson has said about his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein since these files have come out, because I suppose it gives us an idea of the sort of conversations that would have been happening while the vetting was happening.
Yeah, he told the Prime Minister that he regretted his friendship, and Starmer says that he told him that they were barely on any relations or friendship at all at the point, post-conviction, which obviously is not the case. And obviously they were very close friends and they continued to be friends for many years. Our magnificent colleague, Katie Balls, who's our Washington editor, did an amazing interview with Mandelson, which she had to go back for more at the weekend after he was chucked out of the Labour Party summarily. And even in that, he was kind of semi-portraying himself as almost a victim of Epstein's charm. He had this kind of whole line on Epstein charmed me and I wish I'd never met him and it's ruined my life. He seemed as recently as Sunday to think there was a way back from this. So when he was talking to Katie, he was saying that this is a reset moment, that he could go from being the insider to the outsider looking in, and he still had a role to play in promoting Great Britain. So it felt in that interview very much like there was a detachment from the reality of the situation that he was finding himself in. Because since then, Keir Starmer has brought all of the apparatus of the state, all of the apparatus of his office to bear against Mandelson. And he very bluntly has sought to bury him, to just effectively kill Mandelson politically.
Such deceit is incompatible with public service. Let me be clear, no one is above accountability. And no one, however well connected, however experienced, however senior, should hold public office if they cannot meet the basic test of honesty.
He launched a Cabinet Office investigation. He got the Cabinet Office to pass on its own concern. There was criminality here to the police at a very sensitive moment in the investigation. He told his cabinet that this was gobsmacking the revelations and that Mandelson had let his country down. He went and stood at the dispatch box and said Mandelson lied and lied again. So very clearly, in every way possible, he's stripping of his peerage. He's stripping of his Privy Councillor. He is burying him. And the question is, politically, will that be enough to get Starmer through this?
Well, Steve, you've set it up. That is the question. Why has it come back? Given what you've just spelt out, everything that Starmer has done to distance himself, but also to bury Mandelson politically, why does this keep coming back to number 10?
It comes back to number 10 for the reason that we discussed when we started this conversation. And that is the fact that Starmer knew Mandelson had a close friendship with Epstein, and that friendship continued after his conviction for child sex offences in 2008. And that is just not a headline that anyone should ever want. It's a really catastrophic judgment call by Keir Starmer in appointing Mandelson to this role, and that has come back to haunt him.
And Steve, a number of backbench MPs are saying they would be satisfied if Morgan McSweeney was the head that rolled, that Starmer might live on and survive this particular scandal as long as he gets rid of Morgan McSweeney swiftly. Just explain to people how influential Morgan McSweeney is to the Starmer project and why he is at the centre of all of this.
So Morgan McSweeney is the Starmer project. Keir Starmer would not be in power if it wasn't for Morgan McSweeney. When we ask this question of why did Keir Starmer appoint Lord Mandelson, the answer is Morgan McSweeney. So he and Morgan McSweeney go back. Their kind of bond was honed in opposition when they took on the hard left under Jeremy Corbyn. And they spoke all the time on the best approaches to change the party and get someone more reasonable into power. That person turned out to be Keir Starmer. What's really interesting is that Morgan McSweeney clearly rated Lord Mandelson very highly, but Keir Starmer didn't know him. Unlike everyone else seems to know Lord Mandelson, and that web that I talked to you about is very extensive. The one person who didn't really know him, and from what we're told, didn't actually like or trust him, was Keir Starmer. But it's like we were saying earlier on, Morgan McSweeney, he was the guy with the relationship with Mandelson, and he was the guy that was pushing for his appointment. And so for that reason, you'll hear a lot of Labour MPs, particularly left-wing Labour MPs, but some also more moderate ones, saying he has to go. He has to fall on his sword. But do you know what? I've watched this movie many times before, and Morgan McSweeney is just a proxy for Starmer. If you think that removing Morgan McSweeney is going to stop the talk about Starmer's leadership and all of the rest, it ain't going to do that. You can get rid of him, but ultimately that undermines your authority and the questions about you only intensify. And that's the problem he's got. Ultimately, this is a question about his judgment and his decisions, and that sacking Morgan McSweeney might kind of stop the baying for blood in the short term, but in the long term, he's still got the same problem.
Do you think this will cost either McSweeney or Starmer or both of them their jobs? Will this be the thing that ends the Starmer project?
So let's make some predictions, which is a terrible thing to do in my game. I don't think at the moment we are in the Starmer falling down moment. There's a McSweeney, a lot of pressure on him, but if Starmer keeps confidence in him, then he stays. But what it is it's really damaging. And it's a kind of open wound. And it means that by the time we get to the May elections, when Labour's expected to do very badly, it's just going to make things even worse for him, because you've got a load of MPs that are really angry, that will remember this. They're not going to forget this, and they're not going to forget the questions around his judgment. So to precipitate a contest, the Labour rules are very clear. You need 80 MPs to coalesce around another candidate. And no one is doing that at the moment. I haven't seen ministers resigning. Yeah, there are conversations behind closed doors, of course, but no one is going over the parapet. So as long as that continues, which I think it will till May, I think Starmer limps on. And it's a problem for him because he had a speech today that was supposed to be a big speech about pride of place in Britain, in communities, a big patriotic message, £800 million going to local community projects. No one's talking about that.
Am I frustrated and angry that the good work we're doing gets out of focus because of that, and that tomorrow's front pages are unlikely to be about the Pride in Place project? Of course I am. Of course I'm angry and frustrated about that.
Everyone's just talking about, will the Prime Minister go over Mandelson? And so I think for now, and I may be proved wrong, I am frequently proved wrong, it could be that this goes out and subsequently, Starmer goes, McSweeney goes. I mean, God knows, it's all pretty febrile out there, but it doesn't feel like we're there at that point in time at the moment. And I would expect him still to get through to May. But after May, all bets are off.
That was Steve Swinford, political editor of The Times. You can find all the latest on this affair at thetimes.com, and do have a listen to Steve and his colleagues in Westminster, Caroline Wheeler, Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund, in their brilliant politics podcast, The State of It, out every Wednesday. The producers today were Harry Stott and Sophie McNulty. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. Sound design was by Joshua Burton, and theme composition was by Mal Lassetto. If you have any questions about this or any other story, or if you just want to share your thoughts, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.